team, how's it going? Sorry, but I can't be in the lesson today. And also, it's ages since I've done a recorded PowerPoint lesson, so bear with me if I make mistakes. But hopefully this will be useful because it's only how I see this week. So we are going to have a look at a poem which I've mentioned recently, A Little Boy Lost. It's in the Experience collection. So the first thing I'm going to do is just to start us off, just like if you were in the lesson. But I'd like you to engage your brain into social linguistic process terms. A lot of these words are from the AZ in the yellow booklet. And so the words are conformity, radical, suppression, dissent, and eradication. I'd like you to, in a moment, pause the video and just note down those words, note down what you think the definitions might be. Let's call that just about 5 minutes to start off. Okay, so pause the video now. Thanks. Okay, well done for that. And in case you weren't sure about any or you didn't think of the Googling them, I do have definitions here for you. They're going to be relevant to today's term, but also we're going to find moving forward that they're relevant in a lot of the social linguistic process texts that we're looking at. So just pause the video again and note down any you weren't sure about, which is the further definitions I've got for you here. Okay, well done. In today's lesson we will look at this slide. And I want to focus a bit more on structure and a bit of guided annotation on the order and display of our ideas. A really good top-grade answer in the exams will be able to analyse choices of language, form and structure. And so I'm not sure how much last week we structure in the terms, but we're going to go through this one at a time to see the order in which Blake introduces the ideas and the themes of the poem. We're also, as ever, going to link it to social linguistic process. I think today's term is a bit more explicit than some of the other terms in terms of being very much political, symbolic, it's not to take it literally, but I think it's a bit more straightforward in terms of what's being protected. So the political and social protest elements are very much conformity and dissent in today's term. Now, a common trope in social and political protest writing is the inclusion of a character who is a radical free thinker who calls into question the accepted norms and values of society. This character is often accused of attempting to spread dissent. So even last week in our Section A practice, when we looked at Fahrenheit 451, you had somebody who was actually having quite radical thoughts and was challenging the accepted status quo, the accepted way of thinking, and other people didn't seem to like that. And when we start the Kite Runner very soon, we're going to find that at least one character, probably more than one character, very much deliberately challenges the religious for religious ideals and ideas and encourages a member of his family to do the same. So it's something which you get a lot in this genre, and we will look at that today. So it's rarely just the oppressive authority that obstructs the radical free thinker. We've looked recently about how in Blake's poetry there is often an authority figure enforcing the rules. But the radical free thinker also face opposition from conformist society, those everyday passer-bys like in The Chimney Sweeper who just shrug their shoulders, the conformists who resist free thinking and challenges to the status quo. So we're very much going to have a radical free thinker in today's poem, and we're going to see how society responds to these challenging ideas presented. I seem to remember I have to pause at the start of each slide, but maybe I don't need to. So maybe there's a really awkward pause on the video. I'm not sure until I actually watch it back. But either way, we're going to look at the structure of today's poem. So in order to support our arguments with analysis, we should be able to talk about structure. I'd like us to go through today's poem one stanza at a time and to consider the order in which ideas are presented. So you can find the poem now, if you like, on page 90, but actually on my slides, I'm going to be showing you one stanza at a time. It might be better to cover each stanza or to actually just look at the slides before you open up your copy of the anthology, just so that we get that experience of reading it just one stanza at a time and seeing which ideas are introduced one at a time. So this is A Little Boy Lost in Experience. Naught loves another as itself, nor venerates another so, nor is it possible to thought a greater than itself to know. So the poem begins with a meditation on love and the self. We have no visuals, no imagery at this point, just rhetoric. We don't know who's speaking, but we know somebody's speaking because of the punctuation there. So there is definitely a voice, but we don't know whose voice that is. That forces the reader really to focus on the ideas rather than the context around them. There are no visuals to distract us. it's just an idea about love, but actually we love ourselves more than anyone else, and we respect and venerate ourselves more than anybody else, and it's impossible for us to actually see ourselves as inferior and to bow down to anyone, even though we're often told we have to. Now, the ideas here could be considered to be radical free thinking, because actually in Blake's time in the 1790s, they contradict the lessons of the church about loving thy neighbour as thyself. So very much a central idea in the biblical teachings, but the church was very much impressing upon people in the UK, was that actually to be a good Christian and to avoid being tempted to the devil, you had to love thy neighbour as thyself, and you had to not see yourself as more important. Now, whoever this voice is, maybe they're quite innocent, or maybe actually they're quite outspoken, but they're very much challenging that idea. It is said, nor is it possible to thought a greater than itself to know. Now, that's a bit more troublesome, because actually Christians were also taught that God was greater than them, and that actually that they had to accept that. And yet this voice, whoever it is saying that that's actually not possible. They're not saying that they're against God or against the church and its teachings, but they're saying this isn't possible. We are expected to love others as ourselves and to see a certain person, God, to be greater than ourselves, and yet this speaker is saying that's simply not possible. We could only ever see ourselves as more important. We can love others, but we love ourselves the most. You can add some of these ideas as notes now, so just pause, and then when you're ready, we'll go on to the next stanza. Okay, stanza 2. And Father, how can I love you or any of my brothers more? I love you like the little bird that picks up crumbs around the door. So there's some ambiguity here, because whoever's speaking, they could be speaking to a number of different people. Father could be God, they could be speaking directly to God and questioning, how can I love you more than I love myself, because I've been made this way. They could be talking to a priest who would be referred to as father, or it could be the speaker's actual father. So we still don't know who is speaking, but we now have some idea of the audience, and whether it be God, priest, or the parent of this speaker. Generally it's someone who would be expected in Blake's society to be someone who was superior and someone who should be respected and looked up to. So again, it reinforces that idea that this is a radical free thinker, and they're not being rude necessarily or confrontational, but they are very mildly challenging what they've been expected to believe and learn. Now there's a simile of a little bird which suggests innocence. Like the bird, the speaker can only give what it is being given. If the love that the speaker has received is little crumbs, it cannot be expected to give back more love than this. We're going to look at more poems that really explore this idea that actually, but how loving a child can be and how good a person can be, and how much of a chance a person has to stay in that world of innocence, which was important to Blake, very much depends on the context in which they're raised and brought up. The chimney sweepers were pretty much doomed because of the lack of love around them. And so this speaker is saying, well, they can only love as much as they're given love, and really Blake is very much emphasising the innocence here. So even though we don't know who the speaker is, I think it's probably a child. This is another child being used as a motif by Blake to represent innocent thinking and the correct way of thinking, maybe. Okay, so again, you can add some notes. Pause it now if you like. It's a shame you can't pause me in lessons. I'll just keep going. But take this opportunity to pause, and then I'll do the next stanza once you unpause. Okay, and now it's stanza 3, and now we get a lot more visual. So Blake has gradually introduced us into where this child is speaking, or who this speaker is. We find out now that they're a child. So the priest sat by and heard the child. In trembling zeal he seized his hair. He led him by his little coat, and all admired the priestly care. I think there's definitely more irony here, and we've seen that a lot in the poems we've looked at this term, the Chimney Sweeper and the Holy Thursday. So only now, in the third stanza, does Blake establish characters and setting, once the ideas have been established, but this priest apparently doesn't like. So it says the priest sat by, so not a priest, but the priest. And again, that might be an interesting nuance there, but it's the priest, perhaps more representative of the church as an institution rather than an individual with their own thoughts and responses. Now there is a volta. If you don't know that term, a volta is a sudden dramatic shift, and you get it in poetry and plays. But all of a sudden, after the first two stanzas being quite calm and peaceful and meditative, we suddenly have trembling zeal. This priest is trembling with anger. Zeal refers to when someone is zealous, when they are really committed to their way of thinking, perhaps obsessively so. So it immediately shifts the tone and it introduces quite intense tension. But then we learn that all admired, which establishes a crowd of onlookers. All of a sudden, society is being represented here. We've gone from one individual to a crowd of onlookers, all admired for priestly care. So the juxtaposition of seized and care establishes a conflict of attitudes in this narrative. And again, it's something which we've seen a lot recently when Blake seems to be criticising the fact that these priests and other adults who are in charge of small children and their education would often be admired for being caring, whereas Blake saw them as being quite brutal and compassionless. And standing on the altar high, "Lo, what a fiend is here," said he, "one who sets reason up for judge of our most holy mystery." So the conflict is now firmly established between the radical free thinking of the child and the authoritative institution of the church. The child doesn't feature in this stanza, but they're being held there, so they can't speak. They're being restrained by the priest who's holding them up. And they're being referred to as a fiend. Fiend is religious language, and the priest uses it to villainize the child as a non-conformist. There wasn't much harm being done in what the child was saying, and they were very polite. But the priest is depicting them as an enemy of society, a fiend. So the pronouns one and our signify this conflict. One who sets reason up for judge of our most holy mystery. So the priest is offended specifically by the child trying to reason through what is called a holy mystery. The priest is saying they just have to accept what's in the Bible, and they have to accept that, or society is doomed and everyone will go to hell. And so the priest is very much saying that this child is actually daring to be reasonable and logical and try to figure things out, and that's what they are an enemy for. Okay, again, pause and add notes. So on to the next stanza. The weeping child could not be heard. The weeping parents wept in vain. So the child's parents are there watching this. They stripped him to his little shirt and bound him in an iron chain. Now the senses are engaged, and there is now very brutal and negative auditory and visual imagery. It's not just visual imagery now, but there are sounds such as weeping and stripping him. It seems quite brutal as well. Now this is the third use of repetition of little. So in the last few stanzas, little has come up a lot there, which really emphasises innocence. Blake won't leave that idea alone, but this is a child that this is happening to. Now, polyleptoton is a technique which is repetition of the same word but in different forms, so weeping and wept is used here. It seems to suggest that weeping is all that they can do. It is the whole of their existence in this poem. The parents don't try to snatch their child back, they don't try to save their child. All they can do really is weep, but they weep in vain. It doesn't change anything, it doesn't save their child at all. So again, add notes. I will say at this point that you guys have already learned are fantastic at figuring out your own interpretations and ideas. I'm very much giving you some Mr. O'Neill notes here and what I think is important. But if you've noticed something else which might be important, please do add that as well. Okay, and then on to the last stanza now. So that we know that they've stripped him and they bound him in an iron chain, so a manacle, a bit like the Mind Force manacles. They've suppressed him, and burned him in a holy place, where many had been burned before. The weeping parents wept in vain. Are such things done on Albion's shore? Now the poem ends with an entirely different mood from the beginning. Blake leaves us with a sense of the scale of this problem. Obviously the imagery of a child being burned at the stake, maybe like a heretic. I'm going to talk about that in a few slides' time, but I'll just say now, that didn't happen in Blake's time. That was already abolished, in case you're thinking that was still really prevalent. So obviously this is allegorical, this is a metaphor. But obviously that's a horrific image. It reminds me of Game of Thrones, and that just takes me to a bad place. But he's been burned in a holy place where many had been burned before. So it seems that actually lots of people who speak out or challenge the teachings of the Bible as the church interpreted them are silenced in some way, in this case in a very violent and brutal way. Albion is the ancient name for Britain, so the poem ends with a rhetorical question: are such things done on Albion's shore? The fact he's using an ancient name for Britain as well has connotations of the heritage and the very grand nature of the country, and Blake is saying this is what's happening here. So that final rhetorical question is accusatory. Blake wanted to leave us pondering the violence and cruelty of the suppression of thought, and that's very much a very effective way to end the poem. Okay, so again, pause and add notes. I'm going to try and make the rest of this video a bit shorter now, see how we get on, but add some more notes there. Okay, so hopefully the annotations, when we went through it structurally, helped you understand that actually Blake very much chose how to present his ideas, and it started with ideas and then it ended with imagery of ideas being suppressed and silenced, and that was very much deliberate. I'd like us to look at language now, so it's a highlighting task. Highlight each of these phrases below and annotate them with notes about how suppression and conformity is signified. I don't know if you're doing this by yourself or with someone else in the class, but you can talk about it with someone if you like. Each of them in some way show that actually the people in Blake's world and in the world of experience are suppressed and that they are forced to conform. I think the most interesting image to me is the fact this is a high altar. It's very much a place where people can see this example and see this child be villainized and then brutally silenced in that way. It's on a stage where everyone can witness it happening, which seems particularly intimidating and suppressive. Either way, I'm sure you can do this yourself. Add some notes, please. Spend as much as you like on that. I'd say at least 6 or 7 minutes, but do highlight each of those, please. Pause now and then come back when you're ready. Okay, well done. You've been brilliant so far. Just a quick note for AO3, which you could add to the poem. AO3 is context, of course. I've already mentioned this, but by Blake's lifetime, burning heathens and heretics, people who spoke out against the status quo, was no longer legal, and in fact it had been illegal for a very long time. So this means that Blake's rhetorical question is not literal when he says, is this thing done? Do these things happen on Albion Shore? However, perhaps he felt that any suppression of independent thought is as brutal and cruel as that outdated practice. Let's not mess around here. He uses very extreme and very upsetting imagery to make a point, but to Blake, maybe he felt that it's perhaps not as violent, but any suppression of innocent thought, you might as well just burn the child and destroy them if you're not going to allow them to question things and learn for themselves rather than being dictated to. So it's worth adding that as a quick note. Okay, so let's talk about a motif that Blake uses in his collection here, and some of the poems that I'm going to do with you soon contain this, so you might not have noticed it, but you may have noticed that weeping is a motif in this collection. There are many synonyms for crying. Blake could have said sobbing, which is like or wailing, which is more like but he always uses the word weeping. Now Blake seems to have made a very precise choice to signify ideas through this word, and again we've seen it in a few poems that we've looked at this term, but there are more which are coming up where he talks about children or parents weeping. So what might the connotations of weeping be? It's not the same as wailing or bawling your eyes out. It's perhaps a bit more weak and helpless when someone weeps. It's also very unstoppable, you could put down. Now Blake includes repetition of the weeping parents wept in vain in the penultimate and final stanza. What might this repetition suggest? What might Blake be protesting here by the fact that the parents, the ones who created the child and raised them, are now just weeping in vain, and that's actually repeated twice as the burning is happening. So what do you think is being protested here? Just add a quick note there. Pause and then come back when you're ready. Okay, year 13, I think you've got loads of notes now, so that's absolutely brilliant. I'm determined to speed things up a little bit more. So imagine this was your section C task, and imagine that you can use Blake and one of the other texts. It says here, explore the significance of suppression in your studied text. So usually section C in this paper is explore the significance questions, and we're going to get into what that means a lot more over the coming weeks. But imagine that you had to write about suppression in Songs of Innocence of Experience. I would like you to use today's poem to write a paragraph about how Blake presents and signifies ideas about suppression. Try to include some of the terms in the box opposite, and you could base your analysis around the structure of the poem, where we begin with free thinking, which has got no visuals and no other distractions. We're just very much faced with an idea, and then that idea is very much eventually just suppressed and destroyed once the poem introduces more context. I've got lots of key terms that you could use here, but that's the main task. Okay, come back so I can say goodbye, but that's the main thing that you're doing. Pause now and have a go at that paragraph. I will have a look at these. Don't panic about that. I know that you might not be doing this when you would normally have English, but I would like to have a look and see how you did. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think this final slide actually just works best if I'm actually there in the room with you. But you know, I have a think about it anyway. Which one do you think is the best poem? And that could mean anything you like. Which one engaged you the most and meant the most to you, or maybe which one is the best for the exam because it covers a range of themes. But we'll leave it there. The next slide is completely blank, so I don't know why I included it. In fact, let's just have a look at that. Yep, there's a completely blank slide, and do you know what? I will leave that blank slate to finish the lesson. Thank you. Sorry I couldn't be there today. I'd have rather been teaching you guys than doing this course, but hopefully it wasn't too painful, and hopefully they didn't burn me, and I will see you again next week. Okay, take care, Year 13. Bye.